Okay, so you're here with us because you want to know what's going on with all these rumblings and potential shakeups in U.S. higher education.
Yeah, it's a lot to keep up with, right?
It really is, especially with proposed changes to student loans and even the Department of Education itself.
Right, like where do you even begin?
Exactly. So we're here to help you cut through the noise and get to the heart of what really matters.
Yeah, we've been diving deep into a ton of information, YouTube videos, news articles, detailed reports.
All that good stuff. And our goal today is to give you the key takeaways without getting bogged down in the weeds.
Absolutely. Think of this as your cheat sheet to understanding all this complex stuff.
Right. So we'll be looking at things like potentially dismantling the Department of Education, the idea of moving student loans to the SBA, changes to income-driven repayment and loan forgiveness, even a proposal for a brand new free university.
Lots to cover. So where should we start?
Well, a good place to begin is this idea that keeps popping up about getting rid of the Department of Education.
Right, like completely dismantling it.
Exactly. And this isn't some new idea. It's been around for a while, particularly with people like Trump.
Yeah, CNBC mentioned it goes all the way back to the Reagan era, so it's a pretty persistent concept.
It is, and it speaks to a certain philosophy about the role of the federal government in education. But before we get into that, it's important to understand what the Department of Education actually does.
Right, because it's more than just student loans, isn't it?
Oh, way more. I mean, for starters, they manage over $1 trillion in federal student loans, which is just a mind-boggling amount of money.
That's a huge responsibility.
It is, but on top of that, they oversee all these crucial programs like Pell Grants, which help low-income students afford college.
Right, and title funding for K-12 schools in disadvantaged areas.
And IDEA funding for students with disabilities.
Plus, their Office for Civil Rights plays a big role in making sure everyone has equal opportunity in education, including enforcing Title IX.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we're talking about a massive undertaking with a pretty wide reach.
And what's interesting is that the Wall Street Journal and CNBC both pointed out that the department actually has a relatively small staff.
Yeah, something like 4,400 employees, which seems tiny considering everything they're responsible for.
It does make you wonder how they manage it all.
Right. So clearly the argument for dismantling the department isn't about the size of the bureaucracy itself.
So what is it about then?
Well, as both CNBC and the Wall Street Journal highlighted, the main arguments revolve around reducing federal overreach.
So it's about giving more control back to states and local communities.
Exactly. The idea being that people closer to the ground are better equipped to make decisions about education.
Okay, I can see that perspective. But what about the arguments against dismantling it?
Well, those are pretty serious too, and they mostly center around protecting vulnerable students.
Like low-income students and students with disabilities.
Right. Those who really depend on federal oversight and funding to ensure they have access to a quality education.
So there's a fear that dismantling the department could disrupt those essential safety nets.
Absolutely. And it's not like this could happen overnight either.
It's not a simple process.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Both CNBC and the Wall Street Journal made it clear that fully dismantling the Department of Education would require an act of Congress.
Which means it would be a major political battle.
Oh, absolutely. Getting that level of agreement in Congress on something this significant is a huge hurdle.
For sure. And the Wall Street Journal brought up an interesting distinction between a soft abolish and a hard abolish.
Can you explain what that means for our listener?
Of course. So imagine a soft abolish is like rearranging furniture in your house. You might get rid of a specific room, in this case, the Department of Education, but all the furniture and stuff inside just gets moved to other rooms, meaning other federal agencies.
So Pell Grants, for example, might end up under the Department of Health and Human Services.
Exactly. The programs themselves wouldn't necessarily disappear. They'd just be managed by someone else.
Right, whereas a hard abolish is more like getting rid of the furniture entirely.
It's not just moving things around, it's eliminating them completely.
So in this scenario, not only would the Department of Education be gone, but many of its programs could be defunded or eliminated altogether.
And CNBC pointed out something really important, even if there's a soft abolish it. The laws that created these programs would probably still exist.
Unless Congress specifically voted to repeal them and cut off the funding.
So, for instance, Pell Grants wouldn't automatically vanish just because the Department of Education is gone. It's more about who's in charge of running them and what the overall framework looks like.
Precisely, it's a shift in administrative responsibility and potentially a shift in how much emphasis and oversight the federal government provides.
Right. And this gets to the heart of the ideological debate behind all this.
It does. CNBC even quoted a spokesperson from the Trump transition team who talked about school choice as a civil rights issue and advocating for giving more power back to the states.
So there's this belief in local control and parental choice as the drivers of better education.
Exactly. So it's not just about bureaucratic structures, it's about fundamentally different views on how education should be run in this country.
Shifting gears a bit, let's talk about another major change that's been proposed, moving the entire federal student loan portfolio to the Small Business Administration.
The SBA, wow, that's a pretty radical idea.
It is, and the detailed report, along with several other sources, confirmed that this is a serious proposal, moving $1.6 trillion in student debt to an agency that mainly focuses on helping small businesses.
Doesn't seem like the most natural fit, does it?
Not really, and the detailed report highlighted a major concern. The SBA has absolutely no experience in managing student loans.
Right. It's not just about transferring money. It's about having the expertise and infrastructure to handle things like loan servicing repayment plans and borrower support.
Exactly, and the detailed report made a great analogy. It's like asking a landscaping company to suddenly manage air traffic control.
Totally different skill sets.
And as if that wasn't enough, the SBA is also going through a massive workforce reduction, like a 43% cut, according to the detailed report.
So they'd be taking on this huge new responsibility with a significantly smaller staff.
It seems like a recipe for disaster.
It does, and advocacy groups are understandably worried, as the detailed report pointed out. They're concerned about the legality of this transfer and the potential impact on borrower protections.
Because student loans have specific regulations designed to safeguard borrowers.
Right, and there's a fear that those protections could get lost in the shuffle if an agency that's not familiar with student debt is suddenly in charge.
This definitely adds a whole new layer of uncertainty for people with student loans.
Speaking of uncertainty, let's move on to some changes that are already happening. The alterations to income-driven repayment plans, or IDR.
Yeah, this is something that's impacting people right now.
It is the detailed report, and news outlets like News Center Maine are reporting that enrollment in IDR plans has been suspended.
This happened after a court ruling blocked the Biden administration's Savee plan.
Right, and this is a big deal for millions of borrowers.
For those who don't know, IDR plans let people make monthly payments based on their income and family size.
With the promise of loan forgiveness after a certain number of years.
Exactly. So suspending enrollment really throws a wrench in people's financial plans, especially those who were counting on these plans or were about to enroll.
As the detailed report noted, this could mean unexpectedly higher monthly payments and a less clear path to loan forgiveness.
Basically, the rug's been pulled out from under them.
It has, and it's no surprise that this has triggered legal action.
Yeah, the detailed report mentioned that teachers' unions and advocacy groups have filed lawsuits.
They're arguing that suspending IDR enrollment is illegal because it restricts access to repayment options that are guaranteed by law.
So for our listener who might be freaking out right now, what should they do?
Well, News Center Maine spoke to some experts who gave some solid advice.
Like what?
First, they said, head straight to studentaid.gov and use their loan simulator to see how your payments might be affected.
Makes sense.
They also said, take a close look at your budget to see if you can cut back on spending or find ways to increase your income.
Practical advice, but probably not what people want to hear.
No, but the experts were very clear about one thing. Don't just stop making payments altogether.
Right, because that can have serious consequences.
Letting your loans become delinquent can tank your credit score and eventually lead to default.
Which can mean wage garnishment and even losing some government benefits.
Exactly. So while forbearance or deferment might seem tempting as a temporary fix, they can end up costing you more in the long run.
It's definitely not a decision to make lightly.
And Student Loan Planner gave us some insight into just how anxious borrowers are right now.
What did they say?
Apparently, a lot of their audience is worried that the 2025 year income-based repayment option might disappear by the end of 2025.
Wow, so there's a lot of uncertainty looming over the future of repayment.
There is, and this uncertainty bleeds into our next topic. Changes to the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, or PSLF.
So what's happening with PSLF?
Well, the detailed report and Forbes Both reported that the administration is thinking about making eligibility stricter.
Like
They might exclude organizations that are considered to be involved in controversial activities.
controversial, that's a pretty broad term.
It is, and that's where things get a little concerning because this could have a big impact on people who work in public service.
Right, because the whole point of PSLF is to encourage people to go into those fields by offering loan forgiveness after a certain number of years.
Exactly. And Forbes highlighted that the administration, and I'm talking about Trump's views here, believes that the PSLF program was abused by the previous administration.
Abused? What does that even mean?
Well, the thinking is that funds were wrongly given to activist organizations.
So they want to narrow down who qualifies for PSLF.
And it's not entirely clear what they consider controversial.
Right. Forbes mentioned organizations that might run afoul of immigration laws, those providing health care to transgender youth, and those supporting DEI initiatives.
Which is pretty vague and could potentially exclude a lot of legitimate nonprofits and public service organizations.
This could seriously undermine the purpose of PSLF.
It could, because if the eligibility criteria become too narrow or politically motivated, it might discourage talented people from going into public service.
That would be a real shame.
It would. Now, while all this is being discussed, Forbes made a crucial point.
What's that?
The process of actually changing the rules through the Department of Education is usually slow and can face legal challenges.
So these aren't instant policy shifts.
Exactly. And for our listener who's currently working towards PSLF, Forbes stressed that the program is still in effect.
So keep certifying your employment and making those qualifying payments.
Exactly. Stay informed and keep meeting those requirements.
And Student Loan Planner added an important historical note.
What's that?
Even before these proposed changes, PSLF had a pretty low success rate.
That's right. It was partly because the rules were complicated and there were lots of administrative hurdles.
So even without these new changes, PSLF has been a tough program to navigate.
It has. So we've talked about dismantling the Department of Education, transferring student loans to the SBA, changes to IDR and PSLF.
Lots of potential upheaval, but there's also this really bold proposal for a free American Academy.
Yeah, Ryan Swait from 9-Month College Grad on YouTube has been talking about this a lot.
What's the basic idea?
It's essentially a tuition-free online university open to all U.S. citizens.
Wow, a completely free university.
That's the goal, and it's supposed to compete directly with those big-name legacy universities.
So how would they pay for something like that?
Well, Swade explained that the funding would come from taxing, fining, and even suing large private universities with huge endowments.
So they'd basically be taking money from the existing system to fund this new one.
Exactly, and they're aiming to do this without adding to the national debt.
That's a pretty ambitious goal.
It is, and it's a very different approach to higher education funding.
What about the curriculum? What would students actually learn?
Well, Swade described it as being very broad, covering traditional academic subjects, but also a wide range of skilled trades.
So you could potentially get a degree in history alongside a certification in welding or coding.
Exactly. It's a much more expansive view of what a university can offer.
And how would they actually deliver all this education?
Swait mentioned a mix of online learning study groups, mentorship programs, partnerships with businesses, and using new technologies.
So it sounds like they're going for a more flexible and hands-on approach.
Exactly. And another big talking point is that the American Academy is supposed to be non-political and free from wokeness.
Okay, but in practice, that could be tricky.
Oh, absolutely. Defining and enforcing those terms would likely lead to a lot of debate and scrutiny.
For sure, and one of the biggest questions about any new university is accreditation.
Right. Swait said the goal is for American Academy degrees to be recognized by the U.S. government and federal contractors.
Which implies they'd need some kind of official accreditation.
They would, and they're also thinking about accepting transfer credits from other universities.
So students wouldn't necessarily have to start from scratch.
Exactly. Now, of course, when you hear Trump and university together, it's hard not to think about Trump University.
Like that whole debacle back in the 2000s.
Yeah. Swait addressed this directly and emphasized that the American Academy would be completely different.
How so?
Well, Trump University was mainly focused on business and real estate training. It faced a ton of lawsuits and accusations of being a scam, and it wasn't an accredited institution offering real degrees.
So the American Academy is supposed to be a legitimate degree-granting institution with a much broader scope.
Exactly, and it's important to understand that distinction.
Absolutely. So with all these potential changes, especially dismantling the Department of Education, What happens to programs like Pell Grants and Work-Study?
That's a major concern because those programs are vital for making college affordable.
The detailed report definitely highlighted that worry.
They did. If the Department of Education were to go away, the plan is to move those programs to other federal agencies.
But there's no clear roadmap for how that would happen.
Right. And that lack of a plan is causing a lot of anxiety because those programs help so many students.
And there are real equity concerns, too.
Absolutely. The detailed report pointed out that any cuts to Pell Grants would disproportionately affect minority students and first-generation college students.
Because they often rely heavily on that aid to pay for college.
Exactly. So there are a lot of potential ripple effects here.
And with all these massive changes, it's pretty much guaranteed that there will be legal challenges.
Oh, definitely. The detailed report predicted a wave of lawsuits, especially targeting the student loan transfer to the SBA and the suspension of IDR plans.
So what would be the basis for those lawsuits?
The main argument, as the detailed report explained, would be that these actions overstep the executive branch's authority and violate existing laws like the Higher Education Act.
Which sets the rules for federal student loans and repayment programs.
Right, so the courts will definitely have a major role to play in all of this.
So to sum up, we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have. We've looked at the potential dismantling of the Department of Education, the idea of moving student loans to the SBA, the ongoing changes to IDR and PSLF, and even this ambitious proposal for a free American Academy.
A lot to process.
It is, and it's important to remember that many of these ideas are still just proposals.
They face lots of obstacles like getting through Congress and potential legal battles.
Exactly. So the future of higher education and student loans in the U.S. is very much up in the air.
And all this uncertainty makes it even more important for our listener to stay informed.
It does as things develop. Keep an eye on official announcements and make sure you understand your rights and options as a borrower.
Knowledge is power in situations like this.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's something to think about in light of all these potential changes. What fundamental principles should guide how we educate the next generation and ensure they have access to opportunity?
That's a big question.
It is, what role should the federal government play in all of this, and what might the long-term consequences of these proposed changes be on things like access, affordability, and the overall quality of education in America?
Lots to ponder.
There is, and we encourage you to consider these questions and maybe even revisit some of the sources we talked about today as you form your own informed perspective.
It's a conversation that deserves our attention.
It definitely is, and we hope this deep dive has given you the information you need to participate in that conversation in a meaningful way.
Thanks for joining us.
And until next time, stay curious.